That night of March 3rd, 2020, as I was, hugging my team, and I think at some point I said something along the lines of, we're going to come back and we're going to win.
But tell me in your own words, what are the two Titanics?
The two Titanics are the folks convinced that the route to power for the Democratic Party.
Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, Season 2. A show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party and the movements and factions that might have a chance of saving this country. Today, we are jumping right into the action. Campaign Season 2022. I sit down with human rights attorney Jessica Cisneros about her campaign in Texas's 28th Congressional District and why this race might come down to the wire again. And then in the second half, very senior Democratic strategist Waleed Shahid sits down with Professor Ian Haney-López to answer why did Latino and Hispanic Americans shift rightward, shift towards Trump between 2016 and 2020. Waleed, we have some questions to answer ourselves, don't we?
Where have we been?
Where have we been?
Our last episode came out at the end of August, and since then, we still haven't built back better. And that's what we were trying to cover in the fall. And I think it broke our brains.
It did, yeah.
Sorry, I should use I statements. It broke my brain.
Where have we been? We were working on the actual Build Back Better fight, trying to convince Democrats to pass their own agenda, not a progressive agenda, their own agenda, and also break it down on this podcast. And I didn't have the willpower to make it through both of those. I didn't know how to make a show where it's like, yep, and now it seems like they're cutting this next thing. Not sure what to make of this.
All this shit got cut. Can you believe it? I can't. Kirsten Gillibrand paid family leave. It went down from 6 weeks to 2 weeks.
And now it's gone entirely.
Now it's prescription drugs. That's what all of the House Democratic frontliners ran on in 2018, like the big wave year. They all ran on lowering prescription drug costs. That got cut. Immigration reform was shot down by the parliamentarian. Lowering Medicare eligibility from 65 to 60 got cut. Expanding Medicare to include dental, hearing, and vision got cut. You look at all that and you're like, wow, some of the most powerful forces in the Democratic Party had their signature agenda items cut. Even President Biden, even the President of the United States, is likely going to have his signature child tax credit cut. But somehow climate has survived, which is just pretty shocking to me. I don't know.
It's a confusing story because on the one hand, it is true. The most powerful, most effective part of Biden's climate agenda was cut. But, the way things are going, it still seems like climate is going to be the biggest spending line item. And these are the kind of things we got to unravel this season in our funeral for Build Back Better. But during our hiatus, a number of people would reach out every so often and we'd hear, where's the pod? Where's the show? I really liked that. So we'll talk more about the show at the end, but just want to say if you reached out and said you liked this show and you wanted it to come back, thank you.
And if you reached out to me to tell me that your favorite host was Amira, thank you.
Thank you.
I already know 10 other people have texted me that.
We love to hear that. And Amira will return. And we will break down Build Back Better. What happened? What the happened if people don't follow it professionally? And try to understand why some policies were cut, why some policies might stay in and still get passed in 2022, or maybe not, if you ask me.
There were these really clear lines drawn out in the fight that progressives and the squad waged to pass BIF and Build Back Better together. I mean, it really showed who are the more strong, committed fighters in the Progressive Caucus, and it's really only 6 to 10 people, and if they just had a couple more votes, if they had like 15, 20, they maybe could have been able to hold the line. There are 222 Democrats in the House, 6 of them are members of the squad. I don't know, Guido, run the percentage on that. What percent of seats is that?
Less than 6%.
I'm just saying.
Yes.
You can only fight with the army you have.
Yes. But we're also going to look to the future and see if there are more battles we can win, even if it's not the most uplifting time politically. You know, Waleed, the most fulfilling battles are when you just pick the most despicable targets. You pick some of the worst people in American politics and you just commit yourself to ousting them from the people's house. And that's a lot of what this episode's about. We're going to go down to South Texas, talk about a bad man. And to do that, we've got a new segment for season 2. We hired a private investigator who digs up the truth about some of the Democratic Party's worst incumbents and lays it out.
Very senior private investigator.
Very senior private investigator.
You do your job, and sometimes you find the answers to questions that should never be asked.
Sheriff, we got a lot to talk about.
Who are you?
Who are you?
Thank you, Mr.
P.I. Waleed.
On the first episode of P.I. Waleed, our very senior Democratic investigator takes us to South Texas. P.I. Shahid, what did you find?
You know, I can neither confirm nor deny the fact that there might be Azerbaijani oil relationships in South Texas. That's what reports say. I didn't say that. I don't know what's happening. But reports, ABC News, The Intercept, local media.
Now a source close to the investigation says the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Office is also investigating along with the FBI.
Yeah, Henry Cuellar is being investigated by the agency that is tasked with investigating bribery, corruption, and other sorts of cases revolving around politicians. It's unclear what specifically this investigation is about. You know, I just woke up to a series of text messages from people where they were like, FBI vans are outside Henry Cuellar's mansion and campaign office. And then, like, I looked on Twitter and a reporter was down there and they were, like, taking bags of computers and paperwork and dragging it out of Cuellar's mansion.
Gathering evidence for a D.C. grand jury.
Certainly it looks bad because the feds would have not obtained a search warrant unless they had probable cause that a crime was committed.
Like a day or two after the raids at Cuellar's mansion and his campaign office, ABC News confirmed that the investigations were about Cuellar's relationship with the oil-rich nation, Azerbaijan.
Looking into possible crimes involving American businessmen and the oil-rich country of Azerbaijan.
And then The Intercept did a report where they found out that Cuellar had advocated on behalf of looser restrictions on Azerbaijan's ability to construct pipelines in Central Asia. There has been a revolving door relationship between Cuellar and oil executives in the United States and Cuellar and foreign oil executives, meaning the state-run oil company of Azerbaijan. But we don't know that specific thing, if that's related to that case, but we've known for a long time that Cuellar has had nefarious relationships with many corporate actors, and he takes a ton of corporate money, especially from big oil. But man, sucks to have this right before a primary.
Yeah, yes. The more I learn about this guy, the more I realize that it was inevitable maybe that some dirt would be uncovered, because you think that shady relations with businessmen in the Eurasian oil-rich country of Azerbaijan is as far as it could go. But then you start reading about Henry Cuellar. This is the MO. This is the modus operandi over there.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
He does have a lot of money in the bank, a lot of cash on hand. He has $2 million in the bank, so...
Oh, yeah.
So don't feel so confident.
This guy's backed by the Koch Industries PAC, the Chamber of Commerce. Geo Group is sending PlayStations. He's backed by every bad Republican corporate actor in the United States of America.
Thank you, Waleed. P.I. Shahid will return for future investigations this season.
You gotta watch your back.
But first, we wanted to sit down and check in with Jessica Cisneros. For folks who don't know, Jessica was recruited to run for Congress by Justice Democrats in 2019. She was our first candidate after AOC's shock victory. And she lost by just a few thousand votes in March 2020.
2,700.
2,700. Waleed remembers because it's painful memory. But now she's looking to finish the job in the Texas primary on March 1st, 2022, following in the steps of Justice Democrats like Cori Bush, who also go for the rematch and win their second time around. Here's Jessica Cisneros. Waleed, we'll catch you in the second half.
Bye.
All right. Welcome back. Today on Block Party, Jessica Cisneros, a human rights lawyer and Justice Democrat who is challenging Representative Henry Cuellar in Texas' 28th District. This is the rematch from 2020. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us on Block Party.
Thanks so much, Guido. Happy to be here. I'm a big fan, longtime listener from the very beginning.
Folks who are close to Jessica may know that Block Party was actually her top podcast of 2021.
It was. It came out on my Spotify Wrapped as my top podcast, so truly an honor.
First, I want to start with you, Jess, and this race. On March 1st, 2022, Democrats in Texas's 28th district are going to choose between a human rights lawyer and an incumbent politician who just had his home raided by the FBI. Before we get to that rematch, I want to start with you almost 2 years ago. The morning after a tough night for progressives, Joe Biden had won 10 out of the 14 states on Super Tuesday. And in South Texas...
In Texas, incumbent Democratic Congressmember Henry Cuellar appears to have narrowly defeated Jessica Cisneros to hold on to Texas' 28th Congressional District along the U.S.-Mexico border.
Cuellar won that primary by just 2,700 votes, just about 3% of the total vote in that primary. How did you shake off that loss?
To be honest, I don't know if I have yet. The election, it was on March 3rd, 2020. And on March 4th, which was the day after, I felt really proud. I know that we came up a little bit short. It wasn't what we wanted, ideally, but I know that my team and I left everything in the field, and that was something to be proud of, because I know that when we first started off this election, this campaign back in 2019, there were a lot of people that doubted us, that we weren't going to come as close as we came, but we knew that we had an ear to the ground. We knew that we were out there putting in the work, talking to voters, mobilizing them, and we were able to earn 48.2% of the vote. And it was something to be proud of, because Cuellar has been in office, at least representing Laredo in some capacity or the other, for longer than I've been alive. So for us, especially a very young team who had never seen a federal race like this before, because Cuellar had gone unchallenged for a very long time, we were proud. And we spent the day, March 4th, being around each other, being proud of what we did, and just enjoying that, because we knew that even though we didn't come up with the win, we knew we started something very inspirational for folks here. As you might recall, 10 days later, everything went into lockdown here in South Texas because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I had made plans to spend a lot of time with my family, travel to go visit friends, do the things that I was neglecting because I was running for Congress. And I didn't really have a chance to recover, because all of a sudden everyone's at home and scared because of the pandemic. We didn't know what was going on, what we had to do. I was scared because my dad's a truck driver, my sister's a healthcare worker, so they were really on the front lines. And then by April 15th, 2020, I was back in the trenches because Trump was still in office and I still had a lot of work to do. And I just went back to start being the immigration and human rights attorney that I am. And I was even able to help open up a pro bono immigration nonprofit here in Laredo. So it's been nonstop since. I'm really looking forward to actually doing a little bit R&R after this election, when I know this time around we're definitely going to win. So It's going to be a 180 for sure. But again, we still have a long way to go before we get to March 1st, or at least a lot to do.
So April 15th onwards, you're in the trenches. You were in Laredo, Texas for the 2020 general election, Biden v. Trump. And since that election, Democratic and Republican strategists have not stopped debating what happened and what could happen with Hispanic and Latino American voters, especially in South Texas. In 2020, nationally, Biden's share of the Hispanic vote dropped 8% compared to Clinton's 2016 vote. And in the Rio Grande Valley, the RGV, the 4 counties at the very bottom of Texas, right on the U.S.-Mexico border, all 4 of those counties saw a shift towards Trump. For example, in Starr County, which is in Texas 28, your district, Trump increased his vote share from 19% in 2016 to 47% in 2020. How did you make sense of that shift as it was happening?
It wasn't surprising to see that shift happening because our campaign was out there knocking on doors way in advance before the November election for our primary. And even though it wasn't surprising, it's still shocking to have seen the gains that happened. It was a perfect storm of things. The pandemic obviously drove Democrat turnout even lower. But I do think that it was because there's a lot of anti-incumbent sentiment that was brewing at that time. Because as we were out there knocking on doors, people would say, I've been voting Democrat for a very long time, but things aren't changing for me. I still have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. I still don't have health insurance. I still have to go to Mexico to get any kind of affordable health care. Job security is so precious here in South Texas. I think we have to recognize the circumstances that we live here in South Texas. My hometown has a 30% poverty rate, close to that, and it's been constant for the past few decades. There's 1 in 4 people who are uninsured in South Texas and Texas 28th, and those were pre-pandemic numbers. And to have Republicans fearmonger and be out there and tell folks, in the middle of this pandemic where people are getting laid off and losing their benefits, whatever little benefits that they had, Democrats are going to take your job and they just want you to be home and they don't want you to work. A lot of the pathways to the middle class are oil and gas and federal law enforcement jobs like Border Patrol, right? And it's upsetting, to think of South Texas being only worth those kinds of investments. And then you have people like Greg Abbott, like Donald Trump, constantly coming down to South Texas and visit. Even when it's not election season, they're down here visiting. Obviously, they're using us as a political prop, but they're down here and people see that. And I think that Democrats made the mistake of thinking that South Texas is very reliably blue, and it still is, but that doesn't mean that you can take us for granted. And I think that's the result of what happens when you do take this electorate for granted and you're not giving them the proper investments that they need, that we want job diversification, that we want our minimum wage to be $15 per hour because it's still $7.25 here, that we want healthcare to be recognized as a human right so that we don't have to go to Mexico. So it was pretty easy to see why folks all of a sudden were like, well, I've been voting Democrat for a very long time. I'm still under these same circumstances. I think I'm going to vote Republican now. And I do think that part of that was also because you have very selfish incumbents like Cuellar, who instead of doing voter outreach for both the top and the bottom of the Democratic ticket, he was only looking out for himself. So he wasn't campaigning on behalf of other Democrats. We actually were the ones that were doing that work because during that time, we saw that there wasn't outreach being done for the presidential election here in South Texas, in Webb County particularly. So we teamed up with other progressive organizations. We teamed up with Senator Bernie Sanders, and we actually led phone banks to be able to do that outreach safely. And I think that the stakes are even higher now because we're still 2 years into this pandemic. We've suffered so many loss of life and jobs, and people want and need bold progressive policy that's actually going to meet the moment and the challenges that we're facing right now.
After the general election, the plague is still ongoing. And I know from experience, having hung out in other districts, that after you run once, and especially when you get so close, people ask you, are you going to run again? Are you going to run again? Are you going to run again constantly? When did it feel more certain to you that you wanted to mount another challenge, that you wanted the rematch?
I feel like I ended up making that decision after my birthday in May of 2021, right? That was last year. Yeah, time is just blending at this point. These past 2 years have been the longest year of my life. But I think that was when I made the official decision. But I do think that we all knew, because I mentioned most of my team is from here, from the district, when you last time around, that this was going to be an uphill battle. We're taking on such an entrenched incumbent in Laredo, in Webb County, and this might be a multi-year project. And it was. That night of March 3rd, 2020, as I was, hugging my team, and I think at some point I said something along the lines of, we're going to come back and we're going to win. And I think that was probably like me making the commitment, because we've already done all of this work, and not just our team as in like staff on our campaign team, but all these volunteers, all these folks, both in the district and out, who really believed in what we were doing in South Texas. And we owed it to them to come back and finish what we started. And I think that after being through the pandemic, knowing that the stakes were even higher, there was just no way that I could just drop or throw away everything that we had worked so hard for, and especially name ID, which was like the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome, because Cuellar had been representing this district for a very long time, and we started off with 0 name ID. And if people don't know who you are, they're probably not going to vote for you.
Name ID for folks who aren't campaign professionals is just literally, do voters know that there's someone named Jessica Cisneros, and will they recognize who that is on a ballot? So you're saying getting up name recognition for you is a massive mountain to climb in the first year of this multi-year project.
Absolutely. And also because our district is very rural as well, right? Like, it's hard even being out there and knocking on doors, because many times they're ranches and you can't even reach the door to be able to introduce yourself to someone. So it was a lot of work that we did. And yeah, I just knew that I couldn't just throw all of that away, and that we owed it to our supporters and everyone who believed in us to give it another shot. So here we are.
Win or lose this time, what do you feel like the big accomplishments of this second and third year of this multi-year organizing project that you began in 2019? What's been built this second time that's different?
I think even just investing in our people here in terms of organizing has just been huge. Like, folks know what phone banks are. People know what just knocking on doors and having a script and doing all of those things, even able to fundraise, like, those are skills that are applicable not just in electoral organizing, but issue-based organizing as well. And just that sense of hope, where the reason why Cuellar hadn't drawn a primary challenger, a serious one, in a very long time was because people thought it was impossible. And here we are showing them that it's not, right? That this 26-year-old first-time challenger with the support of her community was able to almost knock him out in the first race, and that's huge. So we're pretty excited. We don't want to take anything for granted, and I'm never going to take this community for granted, because I think this shows, when we're able to be Cuellar, it shows what happens when you do, and I know my community deserves a lot more than that. Unfortunately, a story like mine, going on to become an immigration attorney, and it's been an exception and not the rule here in South Texas. But I think this campaign is also an example of what happens when you do invest in the talent that is here, and that we rise up to the challenge, and we obviously punch above our weight. So I hope that's what people take away, regardless of what happens on March 1st. But we're obviously going to do everything possible to make sure we come out on top this time.
Let's talk about Henry Cuellar and why you feel so strongly that voters deserve someone better. Listeners may not be familiar with Cuellar. If folks heard about him from your first challenge, they might have heard that he voted with Trump 70% of the time, making him by far one of the most right-wing Democrats. And if you turned on the local news in Laredo recently, you may have heard
agents reportedly at the home of Representative Henry Cuellar in Laredo.
But from what I've read, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to put aside this ongoing investigation. I think news is going to keep coming out. But even before this FBI raid, help us grasp Henry Cuellar's mode of operating.
Well, it's always been an inside joke of the campaign that whenever we introduce our campaign to someone that might not be familiar with Cuellar, we always talk about, like, my opponent is anti-choice. He was voting with Trump 70% of the time. Our district is super blue. It's a reliably blue district. And Cuellar is taking money from the Koch family. He's had an A rating from the NRA, top recipient on his side of the aisle from the private prison industry, and big oil, and you can go down the list and on and on and on, right? And people are like, oh, wow, yeah, that's a really bad Republican you're running against, especially since your district is safely blue. And then we're like, actually, it's our Democratic Congressman, Henry Cuellar. And then people are just shocked that there's a Democrat or someone that pretends to be a Democrat elected in this seat. So it's not surprising that this is happening. Obviously, we're still trying to see what exactly is being investigated and what Cuellar's role in that is. But we're trying to be super ultra focused on making sure that folks are aware, because I think that it makes them more likely to pay attention to what we've been saying from the very beginning, right? Like, he's corrupt, and it's because of all that corporate PAC money that he's been voting the way that he's been voting and not in the best interest of people of the district. So folks are definitely paying attention now. They already were, just because we're so close to the election. But I think this adds an extra dimension to where people are like, it seems like shady deals are happening here. And I really like what she has to say in terms of what she'll be fighting for. So she'll have my vote.
One of the pitches that Cuellar will give to voters is that he brings the bacon home, essentially. That because he is a good operator, the district gets money from appropriations, and he's good at bringing the pork home. Of course, right now in Congress, the Democrats' domestic agenda, Build Back Better, is being cut up and stagnating.
You know, we have to recognize that the whole reason why holding the line had to happen was Cuellar was one of the handful of Democrats that were actively obstructing President Biden and the Democrats' Build Back Better budget from getting passed through Congress. And he didn't recognize, or at least he claimed that he didn't know, that there was already a compromise in getting both the Build Back Better budget and the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed at the same time. He told me that during a forum. So he was only going to fight for the infrastructure package.
And for folks who don't remember why this was going down, after June 2021, this is when it became very confusing. Biden's whole domestic agenda, formerly known as Build Back Better, then the American Jobs and Families Plan, was split into two: bipartisan infrastructure framework and the Build Back Better budget. But the president, House Speaker Pelosi, the consensus in the party was, this is still the agenda we won on. This is what we're going to pass. These two things need to be passed together. And by August, a group of 9 conservative Democrats, including Henry Cuellar, already out there saying, pass the infrastructure deal without Build Back Better. Dark money groups like No Labels, that always oppose raising taxes on corporations and always take positions that would obstruct anything good from happening in Congress, start running ads to support Henry Cuellar that sound like this.
It's the nightmare the Democrats like our Henry Cuellar warned us about.
Our Henry Cuellar.
What America will find out if it gets a trick or a treat from Washington. The treat, a sweet bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Sweet bill.
The trick, a scary group of progressives has tied it all to another big tax and spend goodie bag.
Wow.
It's time to stop the tricks and pass the infrastructure bill by itself by Halloween.
That ad was so foolish and really did not help voters understand that what was being discussed was the agenda that Biden ran and won on. We couldn't help but make a commercial of our own.
Joe Biden promised he would build back better. making historic investments in clean energy, education, and broadband, expanding Medicare and childcare. But these 9 conservative Democrats are sabotaging Biden's agenda because it would make billionaires and corporations pay their fair share. Tell Representative Cuellar, stop obstructing and start working for the American people.
And to circle back to your original point, we would have had a much better shot at passing a more robust Build Back Better if Henry Cuellar had spent his time fighting for that agenda instead of obstructing it publicly.
The fact that he was holding, the line for no labels was the reason why all of this had to happen.
So what would you have done differently as Congresswoman Cisneros?
I mean, the contrast would have been night and day. For me, it's really easy what I would have done because I know what passing the Build Back Better bill would have meant for people here in South Texas. People getting expanded Medicare, our seniors especially getting hearing aids, being able to count on more affordable childcare, more money in families' pockets. Like, those things are bread and butter issues here. So the fact that Cuellar was out there obstructing that, pretending to not know what the ramifications of not getting both bills passed at the same time is just frustrating. And now, especially in hindsight, seeing that the budget might not even get passed at this point, it's just really obvious that he was doing the bidding of his Republican corporate interest and his donors in trying to obstruct that bill. And that's something that we're definitely talking to voters about, because I think the beauty of almost defeating him last time is that people are absolutely paying more attention to how he's been acting in the House. And I think to top it off, telling folks, like, not only was he obstructing, but now he's taking credit for getting it passed through the House, but then he's also on the Senate side, in the Senate chambers, advocating against the passing of the Build Back Better budget. People are like, that's not right. And that obviously isn't in the best interests of folks down here. So he needs to go.
Taking credit for passing it through the House while you ask your colleagues in the Senate to keep blocking it. Amazing.
Very Henry Cuellar. It tracks.
Very Henry Cuellar. Well, Jess, we're going to have our eyes on South Texas for the next month and a half. If folks listening want to learn more about your campaign, get involved, what should they do?
They can go visit jessicacisneros.com. It's Jessica and then my last name, CISNEROS.com. There's a ton of opportunities to get involved and help our election. We are going up. We're one of the first primaries. Texas has their primary on March 1st, so we don't have that much time. We need folks to give whatever they can. We need them to donate their time. If you are a good phone banker or any other kind of voter outreach that you can help us do, we very much need the help that we can get, because this is going to set the tone for the rest of the midterm elections, and we want to make sure that we're fighting for the best shot at having progressive representation in Congress.
That's right, and sometimes these primaries are decided by just a few thousand votes.
It's true. A fun fact is that Cuellar actually got to Congress by primarying an incumbent, and he won by 42 votes. So every vote counts. We really need all the help we can get. All hands on deck. We are a couple of weeks away.
Jess, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you are taking care of yourself out there.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the invite. And now I can scratch that off my list. I was able to join you all for a block party.
And now a word from our sponsors.
It's not easy to keep paying attention to American politics right now.
Just reading about all the things that aren't working.
Watching everything on the news has just been so overwhelming.
You try to make sense of it, but it just leads to despair.
I look at the world and the state of the world. I feel quite hopeless, and I feel like my faith in humanity is starting to just go.
There is a way to shake off this despair, but you can't do it alone.
Even when a lot of things may seem out of whack or hopeless, being a part of the Justice Democrats, especially as a volunteer, is really what helps me push forward.
If you feel like nothing matters anymore, then we've got a surprise for you. 21st century phone banking technology can let you call hundreds of Democrats in South Texas and tell them about Jessica Cisneros. And you might find it makes you feel a lot better.
You're just constantly inspired because you see at the ground level, bit by bit, these things that you're doing every day that really move the ball forward. And it's just so satisfying. And you feel just way less pessimistic.
One phone call at a time, we can change people's hearts and minds. And in the long run, it's not winning every single campaign that's going to cure our depression. It's the friends and community we make along the way.
Everyone here is so great. It's such a great atmosphere.
Through phone banking, I was able to build the unlikeliest of friendships with people I would have otherwise never met.
Remember the first time Cisneros challenged Henry Cuellar? She lost by only 2,700 votes. The truth is, you can make a difference, but only if you remember.
I'm not doing this alone. We're doing this together, and we got this.
Sign up to Phone Bank at justicedemocrats.com/volunteer. That's justicedemocrats.com/volunteer. Justice Democrats does not guarantee political revolution will immediately follow phone banking. Everyone in this ad is a real volunteer at Justice Democrats. Side effects of volunteering may include increased self-esteem, more diverse and rewarding friendships. Thank you so much to Jessica Cisneros for sitting down with us. Waleed, before we enjoy this conversation with Professor Ian Haney-López, anything we gotta know? The audience may remember that you're a very senior Democratic strategist. This is a conversation about what's been going on amongst the very, very senior Democratic strategists in the party.
I mean, what's important to know is that since 2016, Ian Haney-López has been chewing on this question that gets thrown around all the time, which is, should Democrats focus on people of color or should we focus on non-college voters? Should we talk about race? Should we talk about class? And
should we not talk about race? Should we only
talk about race? Should we only talk about race? And Ian has really blown up that debate ever since 2016, and he's continuing to add new layers to it, new nuance to it, especially around his analysis of what is happening to Latino and Hispanic voters in this country. So I think Professor Ian Haney-López is one of the most dynamic thinkers in the progressive Democratic Party ecosystem right now, and the man is not afraid of telling it like it is and naming his adversaries. Some call-ins are made. He went off.
Yes. I really enjoyed editing this interview, and I agree. Whether you agree or not with all of Ian's takes, I feel like he's engaged in politics in the present, trying to take the tools of the academy and answer some tough problems. All right, enjoy.
Welcome back to Bloc Party. Today I'm joined by Professor Ian Haney-López, the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California, Berkeley, author of one of my favorite books, Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. Professor Haney-López is not just an academic. He works on a number of public polling and communications projects. He's got a foot in the real world. Ian, I believe you are also one of the dangerous critical race theorists. I don't know if you self-identify with that, but I hear a lot about this genre of academic these days.
Guilty as charged. I'm not just critical race theory. I'm critical race theory in zany Berkeley.
Ian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks, and glad to join you.
Ian, who are you? And when did you become interested in the real-time dynamics of American racial identity and American partisan politics?
So I'm a Latino myself. My mother's an immigrant from El Salvador, though I was born and raised here. And by the time I became a graduate student, I really became interested in race and racism. One of the interesting things was that my mother opposed my interest. She's like, why are you looking at racism against Latinos? If people want to come to this country, they just need to put their heads down and work hard. Yes, there's racism. No, it's not what's mainly holding back Latinos. But from my point of view, as somebody who was focusing on history and then who was studying law, I could see the long pattern of exclusion, mistreatment, dehumanization, the role of empire, the role of capitalism. Like, I could see those things. And so across the two generations, we were very different stories about the racial position of Latinos in the United States. And her story was one in which we come, we work hard, we succeed, our children succeed. And from her point of view, it would be hard to accept any other sort of story as an immigrant, given all she was sacrificing, leaving behind all her dreams for the future. Whereas from my point of view, it was a marker of my acculturation, my assimilation, my education, that I had a different view of how race worked in the United States.
Well, we're going to return to the shifting divides within non-white racial identities soon, including the study you did the summer before the 2020 Biden versus Trump general election. But first, Ian, some listeners may think to themselves, Democrats seem so confident that, quote, demographics are destiny, unquote, 5 years ago. What the hell happened?
Reality has beat that idea down with a club. Between 2016 and 2020, every major non-white racial group increased its support for Donald Trump. Asian Americans, African Americans, and especially Latinos, every major non-white group increased their support for Donald Trump. And this was a shock to the idea that people of color are necessarily Democrat, a shock that a politics aimed at mobilizing white racial resentment should speak persuasively to communities of color. How can we understand that?
I mean, it's certainly been a shock that Democratic pundits have struggled to discuss this coherently in the past 2 years. I was just wondering, did you think your childhood and your conversations with your mom as a young adult, did that give you an edge on how to approach these shifts?
It really informed the research I did in the summer of 2020, which is quite contemporary. So I'd been talking to Tori Gavito from Way to Win, and she said, hey, we got to figure out what's happening to Latino voters. And here are all these theories, and some of it was immigration, some of it was assimilation, some of it was economics, family origins, or people's families from Mexico or Central America or Cuba or South America. And I said to Tori, what do you know about how people understand the racial position of Latinos as a group in the United States? Because here's my intuition, people want to belong. And belonging in the United States is first and foremost a story about race. So we got to figure out how Latinos are thinking about race. And it was after that conversation that we worked with different groups, including Equis and Celinda Lake at Lake Research. We did 14 focus groups. We polled over 1,100 Latinos across the country. And it turned out the number one predictor of whether Latinos were sympathetic to a Trump-style racial fear dog whistle message, the number one predictor, more than age, more than gender, more than region, more than family national origin, the number one predictor was how they thought about Latino racial identity.
Okay, I'm just going to pause here for a moment. The key predictor is how they thought about racial identity, how Latino or Hispanic Americans make sense of who we are, our place in America, our future here. You're not looking at race, meaning you're not looking at being Latino or being Hispanic as an essential, unchanging category. So what did you find? How did you categorize the divisions within the Latino Hispanic community?
Three basic options. One option is, hey, we're like African Americans. Latinos are people of color. That's 25%. They thought Latinos were a group that was like African Americans, destined to remain distinct over generation. That is, if they thought the way many of us as activists think. They are very skeptical of the Trump message, very sympathetic to progressive counter messages. But that turned out to be no more than 1 in 4 out of all Latinos. 1 in 4. 60% say we're either standing outside of race and we're just going to get ahead through hard work. And you can really understand this as saying, I know there's a big issue here. It's not going to hold me back. It's not going to shape the lives of my children. And part of that 60%, you get another group that say, we're like European Americans. Over generations, we're joining the mainstream. If they thought Latinos were like European Americans, or if they thought Latinos were a group that stood outside of race and could just get ahead through hard work, 30% in each of those. They were quite open to a dog whistle racial fear message, even one that talked about illegal immigration from countries overrun with drugs and criminal gangs. In addition, there's another 17% who said, we don't know. We're not really sure.
Ian, I do politics for a living, and this is hard for me to keep track of. It's extremely complex.
No, but let me push back on the idea that this is complex. Here's the basic insight. Race is not about monolithic categories of people. In American politics, race is the number one moving force in realigning our electoral politics. But race does not operate in terms of monolithic categories of people. We look at whites are dividing 60-40. Right now, and we wouldn't say 60% go in the Trump direction, 40% go in the Democratic direction. Therefore, race has nothing to do with how white voters are voting because there's a basic schism among whites. No, we understand that it's race and that people relate to race differently, even within a single category. That's the same insight with respect to Latinos. I don't know how many commentators have said, oh, look, a large percentage of Latinos just voted Republican, therefore, Latino identity and race are irrelevant in politics. Couldn't be further from the truth. We're not a monolith. White folks aren't a monolith. African Americans aren't a monolith, and Asian Americans aren't a monolith. Race works not as a categorical identity, but in terms of our relationship, the relationship of individuals to a set of ideas. And what are the ideas that are so powerful in American politics? The basic idea that some of us are good, deserving, hardworking, tax-paying, and law-abiding, and others of us are dangerous, tax cheats, welfare queens, lazy, and that division between good people and bad people somehow corresponds to color, culture, or the way you arrived. That's the core idea. And you see a lot of white folks embracing that idea, but a lot of them rejecting it. You see a lot of Latinos accept it, but also a lot of them reject it, right? That's the conversation we should be having. How do we relate to these ideas about belonging or threat?
Is it that different from the conventional wisdom now about how Italians became white, how Irish became white? Is it following a similar trajectory to the American story of white ethnics? Is there something distinct about it? I'm curious what you think.
It depends on how much you know about history. I think that there's a couple of elements of it. One element of the gradual expansion of whiteness is relatively familiar among educated race critics, let's say, people who are critically educated about race, that the move to claiming white racial identity requires the adoption and enforcement of ideas of racial hierarchy. It requires punching down. And I think that's exactly right. Alexander Saxton in The Indispensable Enemy wrote about this. As the Irish sought to escape a racially inferior position on the eastern seaboard by moving west, they claimed a racially superior position by actively campaigning against the Chinese. Right? Like they punched down. They said, there is a real racial inferior. It's that guy. It's not me. Okay? And I think that is very much part of the move to claim a white racial identity, is to say, if I want to be grouped with a superior, I need to identify and punch down at the inferior. Here's the other thing that people are less familiar with. And that is, The expansion of whiteness often occurs when it serves elite interests. That is, that it's not simply about the agency of a particular group punching down and climbing. It's often about elite interests which are served by expanding the conception of whiteness, precisely because race is first and foremost a tool of social division that serves those who want to hide the real distribution of power in society between the very few and all the rest of us. And so you get these moments of expansion that are often driven by a cold-eyed politics of how to maintain power. And if we want to think about the move, for example, among the Republican Party in the 2000s under George W. Bush and Karl Rove, expand the Republican Party identity so that it could incorporate more Latinos. It had that element of calculation.
As you've written about, dog whistle politics has its origin in the 1970s. Right-wing elites activate and shape an antagonistic white racial identity. And this strategy was developed to solve the problems that the right was facing in the late 1960s into the 70s, to win an electoral majority and crack the New Deal coalition. When you fast forward to Trump, do you see a continuity between the dog whistle politics of the late 60s, early 70s to Donald Trump, to Trumpism today?
Look, it's absolutely true that as long ago as 1970, the Republican Party said, we see a route to power that depends on pulling the white working class out of the New Deal coalition with African Americans by stoking their racial resentment. But at the same time, when that gets started, there's also the sense that we've changed culturally because of the civil rights movement, and that the old language of naked racial grievance, things to talk about white supremacy, for example, nakedly and openly, or the danger of colored people, that language was now widely seen as morally reprehensible. And so instead, the move was speak in code, to talk about law and order and the silent majority versus criminals and thugs. Now, those of us who were paying attention, we understood the underlying racial reference, but it was in code. So fast forward to the Donald Trump administration, 2016 to 2020, Trump is using coded terms. Now, a lot of people are saying, a lot of progressives are saying, this is not code, this is racism, we hear it. Yeah, we hear it. We, as careful observers of American politics, hear it. But over and over again, Trump is careful to talk about illegals and gangbangers and people carrying knives and the China virus. And then when he's pushed on it to say, I didn't mention race. There's not a racist bone in my body. I'm talking about illegals. I'm talking about dangerous people. And anyway, the virus is from Wuhan, China. And that works. And not only does it work, it turns out
there are a lot of liberals who are going to be confused about what you're saying. You're saying that there are many people out there that don't actually hear Trump's words as racist or his rhetoric.
Yeah, let's put a sharper point on that.
You must not be popular in Berkeley, California, Professor.
That's why this whole COVID thing, I just stay in my office. No one knows where I live. We should put a sharper point on that. I've tested Trump's dog whistle message. Obviously, it's popular with the majority of whites. It's popular with the majority of Republicans. It comes across as common sense. People feel warmly towards it. That is also true for the majority of Democrats, the majority of union households, the majority of Latinos, the majority of Asian Americans, and the majority of African Americans. Wow. That is, those of us who are activists, educated, critical thinkers, we listen to a conversation about countries from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs, and we say to ourselves, wow, that's a racial appeal. And it absolutely is. But we should understand it is still a dog whistle in the sense that the people hearing it and responding to it perceive it as common sense rather than as a naked appeal to racism. And let me just be clear. When I say the people hearing it, I mean also the majority of Latinos.
There are strategists, both progressive and moderate in the Democratic Party, who would say, are you sure it's not the economy and in particular the anti-swamp economic populism of Donald Trump? Couldn't that be as decisive, maybe more decisive for voters in some cases? One study by Equis Research asked Latino voters what they thought of key Trump policies, and the most popular policy was the pandemic stimulus checks from Donald Trump. And the least popular policy among Latino voters was the Trump border wall and family separation. How would you respond to these studies and arguments?
I have to say I'm a pronounced skeptic, and it's partly because I'm familiar with the Equis research and I'm familiar with what they left out. So this work that I did in the summer of 2020, Equis was initially involved and then withdrew. That work showed, and it was a significant study, again, 14 focus groups, 1,100 Latinos all across the country. That study showed that the single biggest factor in predicting whether a Latino was sympathetic to a Trump-style message was how they saw the racial position of Latinos. Single biggest factor, bigger than age, than gender, than region, than economic position, than family national origin, whether they were Mexican American or Cuban American. It was how they saw the racial position of Latinos as a group. However compelling their research is on the questions they did ask, that study can't say anything about the questions they did not ask. So Equis has told a post-2020 story about the salience of various factors that they measured, but they didn't measure the impact of racial group position. And that, and now the study I did in summer 2020 suggests that's the single most important factor. And if I think about South Texas, sure, partly it's going to be economic policy. Certainly it's going to be employment in something like the Border Patrol or a prison guard or the police. Certainly it's going to be that. But even more, when I think about people who are involved in public security, they too have an identity story that rationalizes their position. It's an identity story that says there's lots of dangerous people out there, and it's appropriate that I have this job trying to control, trying to detain, trying to incapacitate those threatening people. So it's not that economics isn't hugely important. It's not that the pandemic isn't hugely important. It's that people are thinking about who they can trust to help steer them through economic hard times, to steer them through a global pandemic, to help them lay the conditions that will allow them to succeed through hard work. We must understand that the main political questions for everybody are identity questions. Who am I? Who threatens me? Who will fight with me? They are not policy questions. They're not economic questions. They're identity questions. And maybe an easy way to understand this, like on an economic point of view, imagine somebody says, we need a $15 an hour minimum wage. And the reason we need that is that'll put more money in your pocket. And then along comes somebody and says, actually, that's going to get you fired because it's going to reduce the number of jobs. Most people cannot figure that out on a policy basis. They must default to a question, who do I trust? People are saying different things about what's going to happen economically, policy, hard to understand. Who do I trust? The minute somebody says, who do I trust? They're asking an identity question. Who am I? Does this person respect me? Who threatens me? Will this person fight for me? Or is this person dangerous to me? That's the conversation. And what I'm saying about the Democrats is we need to think about the sort of stories we're telling about what it means to be part of a multiracial party and a multiracial democracy. And so far, Democrats are getting it wrong because we've got this political class that's so deeply stuck in its own silos. It's like the Democratic Party is two Titanics pulling in opposite directions, shattering the unity of the party. We spend more time messaging against each other than against the Republican Party.
Ian, slow down. What are the two Titanics? I think you're referring to the two mainstream positions, the two poles about the strategic direction of the Democratic Party. But tell me in your own words, what are the two Titanics?
The two Titanics are the folks convinced that the route to power for the Democratic Party lies exclusively by mobilizing communities of color and identifying the defining identity of Democrats as around racial justice for communities of color. And I think somebody like Steve Phillips. And the other Titanic is those folks who say, we cannot talk about race. We lose too many people. We need to say things that are popular with all sorts of people. And that is start talking about policy, stop talking about identity. I think the current exponent of that is somebody like David Shore. But both of these positions have a lot of support and define the sort of debate in the minds of many progressives.
Not just the debate, but the funding streams.
And the funding streams and the consultant class. Before I go on, I'm coming out of critical race theory. I've been doing this for 30 years. My primary motivation for talking about, writing about, becoming involved in race-class fusion politics is out of concern for how to end government violence against communities of color and how to build real racial justice, how to dismantle mass incarceration and mass deportation. And it's precisely that agenda that led me to recognize mass incarceration and mass deportation do not reflect white racism in general. They reflect race as a class weapon. They reflect politicians who are backed by big money, who campaign on themes of racial division and then govern that way. And we can build popular majority support to elect politicians who will dismantle those beastly machines if we make it clear to everybody that mass incarceration and mass deportation threaten all of us because they turn us against each other and allow the 0.1% to rule the country.
But you're saying neither of these two Titanics get it right. Take me through the critique. I mean, we love a criticism of the Democratic Party mainstream, Ian.
In one of those identity stories, the left is really defined by its dedication to racial justice for communities of color. And this is an identity story that says we've got to abolish ICE. We've got to defund the police. American society is shot through with racism. There are enormous disparities for communities of color. And justice requires that we stand together, especially with other racially reviled groups, and fight for racial justice for communities of color. As an identity story, it asks people of color to see themselves as victims, and it asks white people to see themselves as potential allies, but more generally as part of the problem. If you're college educated, more likely also if you're African American, have really grappled with the full sort of brutality and dehumanization of racism, you might find that story compelling. But if you're still looking for a way to belong and to have confidence that your children are going to make it and are going to succeed, a story that says you're widely hated is a hard sell. And this is the really hard part. Notice the way that sort of a race left message actually amplifies the rhetoric of the right. Because what the right is saying is, hey, America, we're locked into racial conflict. Racial groups are inevitably in conflict and everyone has to choose a side. Now, what they mean is, hey, good, decent, hardworking, tax-paying white folks, those darker skinned people are dangerous. But their rhetoric, what they're saying is, we're locked into racial conflict, choose a side. And then when the race left comes and says, we're here to fight for racial justice for communities of color. What they're communicating is we're locked into racial conflict, choose a side. And the other silo is the sort of David Shores of the world who are like, we should say what's popular. And it turns out what's popular is what doesn't offend white people. And so let's not talk about race and let's not talk about immigration. Centrist Democrats have been saying the same thing for 50 years. What they say is, if the GOP is going to attack Democrats for supporting civil rights, for supporting African Americans, we know how to solve that. Let's throw civil rights and African Americans under the bus. Let's walk away. Let's stop talking about it. Or an even harsher version, let's show that we'll be tough on African Americans too. This is the Bill Clinton version. Let's crack down on crime. Let's end welfare as a way of life, right? Like Democrats have been saying that and doing that for 50 years. And that too is a disaster in addition to being racist and unethical. And then they use some fancy language about from mobilization to persuasion and and talk in language that's comfortable and brings people in. But what they really mean is, for the love of God, stop talking about race. But what's the identity story? Basically, they've just admitted defeat. Like the whole terrain of politics is identity. You can't succeed politically if you say, that's not a game I'm going to play. We're all wondering who we are and what our future is, right? And we are now a multiracial country. Can we become a multiracial democracy? And the Republican Party is saying, no, we can't trust those people to vote. We can't trust those people to have power. We need to circle the wagons and defend the power of the people who built this country, make America great again. And if the center of the Democratic Party responds to, can we become a multiracial democracy, by saying, let's not talk about it, let's focus on some good policies, we're going to lose. We are losing. So I think this is what plays out in a place like South Texas. More generally, it's playing out with communities of color and with white voters. One party, the Republicans, is telling a scary, convincing identity story. Circle the wagons. We're under threat by invaders from the outside, right? By the savages, the threat to civilization. Meanwhile, Democrats are telling two identity stories that are in direct conflict with each other. One is, we're the people who are going to fight for communities of color, which implicitly leaves white folks out and asks people in communities of color to see themselves as victims. And the other Democratic identity story is, stop talking about identity. Let's focus on policy. Now, this is all the bad news. I really want to make sure in this interview, in this episode, we get to the point that there is good news, because the good news is really good news. And the critique is really a critique that's relevant to political professionals, not to most folks. So the good news is, there's a story.
Just to me, not to the listeners.
Yeah. The good news is there's a story about what's happened to us that really helps people understand and connect a couple of different big things in their lives. Surging racist hatred and surging wealth inequality, that these two things are connected. And the story is, the insight is, for the last 50 years, race has been used as a wedge issue to push us into hating and fearing each other, while the party of big business rewrites all the rules, cuts taxes for the rich, allows corporations to write their own regulations, busts unions, allows pollution to go unchecked. A story of divide and conquer politics resonates immediately with people. It's a story that said, we're all in this together, but some people profit when they turn against each other. Reject the lies, build power with people who look different than you. That's how you provide for your family. The astounding thing is, the first time people hear that story, they like it better than the dog whistle racial fear story. And they also like it better than the traditional Democratic stories of either we need racial justice for communities of color or we're not going to talk about race. We're just going to talk about economic policy, right? So there's tremendous good news, and this good news extends to Latinos. When I tested a message of race as a divide and conquer strategy that threatens all of us, come together across differences to build power with others, that was the most convincing message, not just among Latinos who think we're people of color, but among Latinos who think we're joining the mainstream and among Latinos who think we're just going to put our heads down and work hard.
Oh, wow.
Like, it brings everybody together, because what it says to folks is, I don't care where you put yourself in this sort of hierarchy of races. I don't care whether you're inside it, outside it. I don't care whether you're light or dark, assimilated or a new arrival. I don't care. What I care about is, will you fight with others when people try and divide us so they can laugh all the way to the bank? Because if you're willing to stand with others across difference so that we have the power to protect ourselves from bullies backed by dark money, then I'll stand with you, you stand with me, and we'll be able to take care of our families.
Thank you to Professor Ian Haney-López for joining us today, and thanks for joining the Bloc Party.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a delightful conversation.
Thank you again, Professor Ian Haney-López, for joining us on the Bloc. Waleed, great job. Before we wrap up, any loose ends from that interview that we didn't get to talk about quickly?
I don't know, man. I think I need to go on a walk. Ian really has turned my world upside down over here. I need to think about this for a long time.
All right. Before we go, an update on the show. This is season 2. We're going to aim to release 2 episodes a month. Sometimes I want to edit things a little more. We run into technical difficulties, but look for an episode twice a month. Amira will return. Group chat will return. Some of our faves from season 1 will return, especially to break down Build Back Better, including Professor Ruth Block Rubin and Mary Small.
Why didn't you say Henry Cuellar will return?
Well, there may be a runoff. There may be a runoff in the Texas primary unless we all do our job and get Jessica over 50% in the first round. Isn't that right, Waleed?
It's true.
Anything you want to say about the show, Waleed? Coming back?
Just doing my private investigation work for the people.
All right. That's the show. Thank you so much to the best team in the world. Co-host Amira Hassan, our senior politics producer, Becca Rose, executive producer, Emma DeSau, our lead video producer, Jeremy Flood, the best SFX guy in Hollywood, Austin Bedell, who, if you listen to the hilarious trailer, did great work on that. And lastly, thank you, Wally.
I'm glad to be here, just doing my part. We need to... Wait, what was I going to say?
Our mix engineers, season 2, Leslie Gaston Bird and Rocky Russo. Additional audio assistance by Jemiah Bruce, Laura Corns, and Naomi Graham from Mixed Messiah Productions. See you on the Bloc.
Bye.